The courier box from the Pilbara dig arrived still dusted in ochre grit, the cardboard seams packed with fine grains that had sifted in despite the tape. Dr. Talia Morton slit the top open with a scalpel and pulled back the foam insert. The fossil inside was not impressive to look at, a flattened vertebrate perhaps 40 centimeters long, with the vague ridges of scales and the outline of fins compressed into slate. Devonian strata, somewhere between 370 and 400 million years old. It should have been nothing more than a window into the age of fishes. She slid the slab beneath the magnifier, adjusting the light. Tiny seams in the mineral matrix caught her attention, not fractures but thread-like inclusions of darker material. She took a microsample with a diamond drill, then loaded the powder into the sequencer. The machine hummed, projecting a line of digits on the display. At first it was noise, the messy fragments of degraded nucleotides. Then the algorithm began to stitch. Codons aligned, not perfectly but with eerie familiarity. Adenine-thymine, cytosine-guanine, chains long enough to trigger reference matches. Talia leaned closer, blinking at the improbable readout. The computer highlighted a sequence in green, a section of the mitochondrial genome common to all humans alive today. Her hands went cold. "No," she whispered. "You're not supposed to be here." She ran the scan again. Same result. A third time with stricter filters. Again. By all geological reasoning, this fossil should have been older than lungs, older than forests, older than the possibility of mammals. Yet here it was, whispering fragments of humanity long before humanity was even conceivable. The lab lights flickered, a trivial surge. But the sequencer's monitor glitched, displaying a ripple of symbols that had no place in genetic code. Not letters, not numbers, but vectors. Curved arrows describing transformations through multidimensional space. For a moment Talia thought the machine was failing. Then she realized the vectors were not random. They were describing a translation not between languages but between states of matter. Instructions perhaps. A guide. She shut the machine off, breath quick and uneven. But when she checked the raw readout again, the vectors still lingered, woven into the nucleotide alignments themselves, as if the genome had never just been instructions for proteins but something else, something computational. The clang of the lab's back door jolted her. She spun around, heart racing. A cleaner had come in early, mop rattling in its bucket. Talia forced a laugh at her own nerves, but the sense of intrusion stayed. She had the fossil wrapped and locked back in its case before the cleaner reached the corridor. But she couldn't ignore the flicker of motion in her peripheral vision, on the fossil itself, just before she closed the lid. For an instant, the mineral ridges of the creature's spine had shimmered, as if the compression of 400 million years was not fully settled. Not rock, not bone, something poised between. Talia texted her colleague Lachlan in Canberra. "Fossil anomaly. Need your expertise. Possible physics crossover. We'll send data." Her finger hovered before hitting send. The last part of the message pulsed in her mind. Physics crossover. She'd never used those words in her professional life. She wasn't sure what they meant. Yet the vectors in the genome felt less like biology and more like the laws of motion written in DNA. By midnight she was back in the lab, running thermal stress tests on a second sample chip. The fossil's crystalline lattice shifted under the heat in ways no rock should. Patterns emerged across the surface, fractal repetitions that locked into symmetrical shapes, like tessellations resolving in an alien language. The lab's ventilation rattled overhead. The fossil crackled as if alive, emitting faint clicks. She pulled on protective gloves and tried to move the sample dish back into containment. The fossil twitched. It was minute, half a millimeter of displacement, but it was undeniable. Rock was not supposed to twitch. Adrenaline surged through her. She fumbled the dish, almost dropping it, then forced it back into the chamber and slammed the hatch. The clicks continued for another full minute before going silent. Talia sank into her chair, staring at the locked chamber. The statistics were undeniable. The fossil carried fragments of human mitochondrial DNA, hundreds of millions of years before mammals, encoded alongside alien instructions that described not life but transformations between worlds. And now it had moved. Her mind throbbed with one question. If humanity didn't begin here, then what, exactly, was buried beneath Australia's ancient stone? The proton shouldn't have died. Dr. Lachlan Renshaw stared at the detector output, arms folded tight across his chest. Proton decay, if it happened at all, belonged to timescales so long they mocked human imagination. 10 to the power of 34 years. His detector in Canberra, jury-rigged from surplus gear and government grants, had no right to observe it in real time. And yet the traces were there, not once but dozens of times over the last 6 months. It wasn't noise. It wasn't equipment failure. The particles were slipping, expiring just enough to register. The decay rate was higher here, by a sliver small enough to make him doubt his sanity, yet large enough to break physics if true. He pulled up comparison data from Tokyo and Geneva. Their results were stable, perfectly in line with expectation. Only Australia was anomalous. And only in the last few years. He scrawled equations across his whiteboard, hunting for consistency. The shifts weren't random. They traced a sinusoidal curve, like a hidden rhythm modulating beneath reality itself. A pattern. He cross-referenced against cosmic events. Solar cycles, background radiation spikes, gravitational anomalies. Nothing matched. Then, on a hunch, he overlaid the data onto geological coordinates of Western Australia. The site of the Pilbara fossil finds Talia had been texting him about just hours before. The curve lined up. Perfectly. Lachlan swore aloud. He drove to the synchrotron facility outside Melbourne the next morning, needing confirmation from equipment leagues beyond his cobbled detectors. The air hummed with power. Inside the vast circular chamber, beams of electrons whipped at near-light speeds. He bribed a colleague with coffee and ran a covert sequence. When the results came back, his stomach lurched. Not only were proton decays misbehaving, they were doing so in synchrony with vectors buried in Talia's genome readouts. The math was identical. The implication was savage. The DNA lattice in the fossil wasn't just biological coding. It was a map of altered physics, describing regions of spacetime where constants slid out of their supposed absolutes. The synchrotron shuddered. Alarms blared. Operators shouted as the magnetic fields destabilized. Lachlan sprinted toward the control deck, dodging panicked staff. Sparks arced from a console. On the main display, the beam path warped, not scattering, not failing, but bending into geometries the ring had never been built to sustain. For a heartbeat, the particle stream braided into luminous filaments, forming a torus within the torus, like space itself was folding inward. A lattice appeared, three-dimensional vectors glowing in the heart of the chamber, almost identical to the ones Talia had extracted from the fossil. Then the emergency shutdown slammed the system dark. The torus collapsed. Silence. Lachlan's pulse hammered in his throat. He wasn't imagining it. Something alien had just written itself into their machines. By nightfall he was on the phone with Talia. "Your fossil," he said, voice shaking. "It isn't just an anomaly. It's a template. Whatever's encoded in its DNA is bleeding into physics itself. My protons aren't decaying randomly, they're obeying an instruction set." Talia was quiet. "Then, you saw the vectors too?" "Yes." Her breath hissed over the line. "Then it means we're standing inside a field. The rules here aren't Earth's. There's something else. And if that fossil's a relic of it." Lachlan finished the thought for her. "Then this continent isn't fully part of Earth. It's stitched into something alien." Outside his lab window, the night sky shimmered faintly, not with auroras, not with satellites, but with a slow oscillation of the stars themselves. Lachlan pressed his forehead to the glass, refusing to blink. The southern constellations were fractionally out of place. Not illusion. Not miscalculation. Australia was already sliding into alignment with a different set of physical laws. The third sample burned out the sequencer. Dr. Talia Morton yanked the power lead before smoke filled the lab. The monitor was already dead, its capacitors fried. She swore and shoved her glasses back up the bridge of her nose. 3 machines in 2 weeks. This wasn't coincidence. She still had the raw data though. Her backup unit had logged the critical seconds before failure. She projected the sequence onto the wall. The strands of nucleotides coalesced, not as letters but as shapes, geometric symmetries repeating across scales, shifting from helices into lattices, then into full-blown tessellations. At first glance they were abstract. But Lachlan had already shown her his particle decay curves. Overlaying the genome lattice against his constants, she saw the same pattern. Biology and physics weren't separate. They were co-authors of the same script. She prepared a control test. A cluster of fibroblast cells, human-derived, cultured in nutrient medium. She injected a synthesized strand taken directly from the fossil's lattice sequence. The cells divided normally at first. Then the microscope feed froze. No, not froze. The cells had locked into a configuration that made no sense. Membranes stretched into crystalline planes, organelles refracting light as if they were glass facets. The culture dish cracked. Fluid spilled, sizzling on the bench as though it had been laced with acid. The cells were still alive but no longer chemical in the normal sense. Their geometry was feeding back into the surrounding space, pushing against the constants themselves. She yanked the dish into containment. The warped cells pulsed once, then collapsed, leaving behind a fine dust of silica. Her phone buzzed. Lachlan's voice was ragged. "I tried a resonance experiment," he said. "Ran your genome vectors through a quantum lattice." It responded. "How?" The lattice reconfigured the chamber itself. For 3 minutes the constants shifted. The Planck length was different. "You're saying space got smaller?" "Not just smaller. Different." Before she could reply, her lab's alarms shrieked. Power surged through every instrument at once, monitors cycling with impossible symbols. The fossil case on the far bench rattled violently. The slab inside vibrated, grains of stone sloughing away. Its outline blurred as if another version of the fossil was phasing in and out of place. Talia rushed forward, slamming the emergency lockdown. The steel shutters dropped over the benches, sealing the fossil inside. The rattling stopped. She stood panting in the red glow of emergency lights, heart hammering against her ribs. Lachlan was still on the phone. "You heard that, didn't you?" "Yes." He exhaled. "Then it's not just data. It's active. Whatever this lattice is, it isn't describing life or physics, it's enforcing them. Like software that doesn't care what substrate it runs on." Talia gripped the phone tight. "Then it means our DNA, the part we thought was junk, could be running this code too." There was silence at the other end. Then Lachlan whispered. "Which would mean, we're not just the intruders here. We're the executables." The coordinates were wrong before they even set foot in the desert. Satellite overlays showed the landform drifting over the past decade by a few arcseconds each month. Barely enough to notice unless you measured carefully. But Talia and Lachlan had both seen the fossil's vectors. The drift wasn't geological. It was spatial. The Pilbara sun hammered them as they hauled equipment out of the Hilux. Gravimeters, magnetometers, a GPS array bristling with antennas. The heat made the horizon dance, but the ridge ahead looked solid enough. Ochre stone rising in a crescent, its flanks etched by wind. Yet every instrument disagreed on where they were standing. The GPS gave coordinates 300 meters north of their physical location. The compass lagged as if dragged through syrup. Even the satellite phone cut out intermittently, as though the desert air itself was censoring radio. "Feels like walking on a glitch," Lachlan muttered, scanning the gravimeter. Its needle quivered, refusing to stabilize. By afternoon the instruments began to scream. The magnetometer spiked into nonsense, recording a magnetic field rotating in 4 dimensions. The gravimeter's readout inverted. Instead of weight, it displayed imaginary mass values. Then the ground moved. Not a quake, not a vibration. The ridge ahead rippled sideways, like an image dragged across a broken screen. Talia stumbled back, shielding her eyes. For a second, the ridge occupied 2 positions at once, separated by a dozen meters before snapping back. Lachlan shouted over the rising wind, "It's not the landform moving through Earth, it's Earth moving through it." The air warped. Shadows stretched in impossible angles. Their Hilux, parked 100 meters away, flickered, first one, then two, then none at all before resolving back into place. The desert was no longer obeying its own geometry. Talia grabbed Lachlan's arm. "We need anchor points, markers outside this zone." They sprinted back toward the vehicle, the ground crunching oddly beneath their boots. The sand grains seemed to resist, as though their feet pressed into 2 different surfaces layered together. Halfway there, a whirl of dust erupted ahead. It wasn't wind, it was a standing vortex, grains spiraling in a fixed column. Within it, faint lines glowed, vectors inscribed in space itself, matching the fossil's lattice. Talia froze. "It's the same pattern, alive here." The vortex tilted, moving toward them like a predator scenting prey. Lachlan yanked her arm. They bolted, lungs searing, until they tumbled into the Hilux. He jammed the ignition. The engine roared, tires spitting gravel. Behind them, the vortex collapsed, leaving only the silent ridge. But the GPS still refused to settle. The display looped coordinates across half a continent. Perth, Alice Springs, even Antarctica, before flicking back to Pilbara. It was proof in numbers. The landform wasn't a place. It was a moving anchor, dragging pieces of Earth into alignment with something outside Earth. That night, camped uneasily outside the ridge's perimeter, Lachlan stared at the data. The vectors converged onto a simple truth. "Whatever this anchor is," he said, "it's not just drifting. It's correcting. The continent keeps trying to be part of Earth, and the anchor keeps rewriting it." Talia sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the ridge glowing faintly under starlight. "If it's correcting us," she murmured, Then maybe we don't belong here at all. Maybe we're the ones being rewritten. They dug at dawn. The ridge loomed behind them, a jagged silhouette against the heat haze, while Talia crouched by the soil cores they had drilled overnight. Each core was sealed in glass vials, labeled by depth and position. Nothing unusual to the naked eye, just ochre sand, fine dust, a few flecks of quartz. But the mass spectrometer they'd hauled from Melbourne told another story. The first sample showed isotopic ratios consistent with terrestrial geology. Oxygen 16 and 18 in familiar proportions, silicon stable. Nothing to panic about. The second, taken barely 30 centimeters deeper, was impossible. Carbon-12 had decayed at a rate too fast for Earth's half-lives. Trace elements matched predictions for exoplanetary crusts orbiting Tau Ceti, a star 12 light-years away. Talia felt sweat prickle down her back. "It's layered," she whispered. "Like strata from two different planets jammed into the same column." Lachlan shook his head. "Not jammed. Stitched." They tested more. At 80 centimeters down, the soil refused to stabilize at all. Its isotopes shifted depending on when the measurement was taken. 1 minute it read as terrestrial, the next as wholly alien. The ground was oscillating between identities. Talia rubbed her temples. "This isn't geology. It's memory. The soil is holding on to what it was before it was Earth." The air went cold, unnatural in the Pilbara heat. The open vials vibrated on the tray, grains of soil rising as if magnetized. "Lachlan." Before she finished, the entire tray levitated 5 centimeters, the vials rattling like teeth in a skull. Then one shattered, spilling isotope-shifting dust into the wind. The dust didn't scatter. It swirled into a column, coalescing into a geometry of planes and vectors, a perfect miniature of the fossil's lattice. The pattern hung in the air, whirring like a machine. Lachlan lunged, slamming the containment lid over the tray. The lattice wavered, collapsed, but the spilled dust continued to hum, spreading across the sand. The ground beneath them rippled like water. "Back to the truck," Talia shouted. They scrambled across the shifting sand, every footfall sinking too deep, as though gravity itself was stuttering. Behind them, the soil erupted, cones of dust spearing upward, each one forming a fragment of the lattice before dissolving again. The Hilux loomed ahead. Lachlan dove into the driver's seat while Talia slammed the rear hatch shut on their instruments. The engine roared and they lurched forward, tires spitting dust. In the rearview mirror, Talia saw the disturbed ground settling. The cones subsided, leaving only silence. But the coordinates on the GPS blinked wildly, 3 different positions at once, all hundreds of kilometers apart. The land itself had rewritten, trying to decide where it belonged. That night, safe in a roadhouse 2 towns away, they pored over the data. Lachlan tapped the isotope readouts. "This isn't contamination. It's intentional. The soil's oscillating because something embedded here is forcing it to reconcile 2 realities." Talia leaned forward. "Then every step we take is a lie. This continent isn't fixed land, it's contested ground." Her voice dropped. "And if the soil can remember being somewhere else, maybe so can we." The satellite archives went back 60 years, dusty reels digitized into crisp false-color time lapses. Lachlan scrolled through them on his laptop in the roadhouse, Talia peering over his shoulder. The landform in the Pilbara was visible even in the earliest black and white aerial surveys, a crescent ridge of stone, surrounded by flat scrubland. But when Lachlan accelerated the playback, the ridge moved. At first it was subtle, a blur, a creeping shift. But decade by decade, the ridge slid across the map, disobeying tectonics, ignoring erosion. Always in one direction, never pausing. Talia's skin prickled. "It's not just drifting." Lachlan shook his head. "No. Watch carefully." He rewound the archive and froze a single frame. The ridge wasn't moving through the landscape. The landscape was moving through it. Trees, rivers, even entire mining roads vanished as if swallowed, replaced by different features at the same coordinates. The ridge remained constant, but the world around it blinked in and out of versions. The next day they drove back to the perimeter. This time they brought a portable radar rig and high-resolution drone. The air shimmered again as they neared the anchor. Talia launched the drone. Its feed came through her tablet. The ridge, the scrub, the Hilux parked beside them. For 10 seconds, everything was ordinary. Then the feed glitched. The ridge split into 2 superimposed images of the same landform separated by 30 meters. Trees in one image were replaced by crystalline spires in the other. Kangaroo tracks flickered into trails of segmented impressions left by something with too many legs. Her chest tightened. "It's phasing between environments." Lachlan's gravimeter began to howl, spitting nonsense values, negative weight, fractional dimensions. The ground at their feet wavered, their shadows stretching like rubber bands. The drone feed spasmed again, and suddenly cut to static. The drone itself fell from the air but not onto sand. It hit with a clang as if metal striking metal. The sound made no sense in the desert. Talia and Lachlan sprinted toward it. But halfway there, the horizon buckled. For a fraction of a second, they weren't in the Pilbara at all. A vast alien landscape unfolded around them, black cliffs under a turquoise sky, rivers of liquid glass threading a plain studded with hexagonal towers. The air burned cold in their lungs. Then it was gone. They were back in the desert, both of them on their knees, coughing. Lachlan clutched his head. It's not that the ridge is moving. It's anchoring us to another reference frame. The Earth keeps trying to assert itself, and the anchor forces corrections. Talia staggered to the fallen drone. Its casing was warped, not dented. The plastic and alloy had restructured, folded into crystalline plates. She touched it carefully. Its temperature oscillated between freezing and searing in seconds. Her voice shook. We weren't seeing illusions. The anchor let Earth and another environment overlap. For that moment we existed in both. Lachlan stared at the ridge, its outline shimmering against the blazing sun. We're not on solid ground, he whispered. We're standing on a decision. And it keeps choosing against us. The tremor hit at 3:12 in the morning. Talia and Lachlan were camped 10 kilometers from the ridge, their tent pitched on what should have been stable ground. But the Earth bucked like an animal. Metal cases clattered, instruments toppled. The Hilux alarm shrieked in panic. By the time they scrambled outside, a crimson glow was rising from the desert floor. Not fire, something deeper radiating through the sand itself. Lachlan pointed. There. A fissure tore open along the plain, stone shrieking as it split. The ground sagged into a ragged wound, exposing walls of crystalline strata that pulsed with internal light. Talia's breath caught. The stress lines in the crystal weren't random fractures. They were geometric, perfectly angled, as if equations had been written into the material by pressure and time. She whispered, It's math. They rigged ropes and descended into the rupture. The air smelled metallic, thin, as though the fissure was venting another atmosphere entirely. Their headlamps caught surfaces that glowed with their own logic, interlocking stress fractures that aligned into coherent symbols, vectors describing transformations between coordinate systems. Lachlan traced a glowing seam with his handlight. This isn't tectonic. It's an interface. Equations hard-coded into geology. The walls hummed beneath their touch. The equations weren't inert. They were active, modulating the constants of physics like tuning a radio. The fissure rumbled. Segments of the crystal sloughed off, forming jagged prisms that tumbled toward them. Lachlan shoved Talia against the wall as a shard the size of a refrigerator smashed into the floor. It didn't shatter. It sank, phasing halfway into the ground as if two realities couldn't agree where it belonged. Dust roared up. Talia coughed, vision swimming. The prisms were rising now, not falling, levitating slowly upward, aligning themselves into a lattice that mirrored the fossil's genome structure. The fissure wasn't collapsing. It was building something. Up. Lachlan shouted, hauling her by the harness. They scrambled up the rope as the prisms clicked into place beneath them, layer by layer forming an ascending architecture. Halfway up, Talia risked a glance down. The crystalline lattice wasn't just geometric. It was alive with spectral afterimages. Shapes of organisms flickered within the structure, alien anatomies frozen in frames of light. Segmented bodies, asymmetric heads, wings that folded the wrong way. Echoes of something that had once lived here. And then erased. Her grip faltered. Lachlan caught her wrist, dragging her upward until they collapsed over the lip of the fissure. Behind them, the lattice reached the surface. It stood like a crystalline tower, humming, its equations glowing in the desert night. They lay gasping on the sand, watching the structure pulse with alien logic. Lachlan's voice was hoarse. Those equations, their coordinate transforms. One frame of reality into another. They're not just math, they're instructions for displacement. Talia shivered. Then maybe when we arrived here, something else was pushed out. The crystalline tower flickered once, as though acknowledging her words. Dawn broke over the desert, but the crystalline tower refused to dim. It pulsed with its own rhythm, indifferent to the sun, humming equations into the air. Talia's portable sequencer whirred on the tailgate of the Hilux, analyzing a sample she had scraped from the fissure wall. When the results scrolled across her tablet, she felt her throat tighten. It's not microbial, she said almost to herself. It's complex. Protein folds with no analog in Earth biology. The architecture is wrong, like their amino acids preferred mirror images of ours. Lachlan leaned in. You're saying there was an entire biochemistry here before us? She nodded. And it's not in any geological record because the constants themselves must have shifted. Their physics couldn't survive the one we occupy now. The tower answered her. Its hum deepened into infrasonic vibrations that shook the sand. Equations rearranged themselves across its crystalline surfaces, rotating through transformations too fast for human eyes. The air thickened. A shimmer rippled out from the base of the structure. For an instant the desert was no longer desert. Shapes flickered into view, towering organisms with segmented torsos, broad flat appendages that scissored like sails, eyes that refracted light into spectrums. They moved in jerks as though caught between frames of a broken film. Talia staggered back. There. Residuals, Lachlan said. Not alive. Just phase echoes from the prior state. But one of the figures turned its faceted head toward them. The shimmer surged and the echoes grew denser. The organisms were no longer translucent impressions. They had weight, mass, throwing dust as they dragged themselves forward. Not just echoes, Lachlan muttered. The nearest creature opened its sail-like appendages and lunged, knocking over the equipment table. Talia hit the sand, rolling clear as a case of probes scattered. The thing's appendages stabbed into the Hilix's side panels with a shriek of tearing metal. Move. Lachlan grabbed a seismic sensor like a club and swung, smashing against the thing's torso. The sensor sparked uselessly, but the blow distorted the creature's form as though reality couldn't decide whether to render it solid. Talia snatched the tablet and triggered the sequencer's emitter, an improvised electromagnetic pulse she'd been using to sterilize samples. The pulse snapped across the air. The creature convulsed and dissolved into dust, sucked back into the lattice of the tower. They stood panting, surrounded by scattered gear and gouged sand. The other creatures lingered at the tower's edge, flickering in and out, watching. They're bound to it, Talia said. Half here, half in the prior frame. The tower's equations keep trying to solve for them. Lachlan's face was pale in the red morning light. If the math completes, it won't just reconstruct fossils. It'll restore their entire ecology, overriding ours. The tower hummed louder, and the desert seemed to lean toward it, as if reality itself was preparing to shift again. Lachlan's apparatus was crude by collider standards, an array of field generators cannibalized from seismic coils, shielded in copper mesh, all wired to the oscillators in the back of the Hilix. He tuned the resonance manually, fingers trembling over dials. The aim was simple: excite the anomaly's quantum substrate and force it to reveal what lingered beneath. When he powered it on, the air wavered like heat haze. At first, nothing but static. Then the static coalesced into silhouettes. Figures loomed across the camp, 3, then 5, then a dozen. Not illusions, not afterimages. Their outlines stuttered at the boundary of detectability, flickering with mirror-handed proteins, mirror-handed light. Every organ, every limb reversed in chirality. Talia's voice was hushed. They're not extinct. They're displaced. The creatures moved without sound, their joints bending in counterintuitive arcs. Sails of translucent tissue spread like inverted wings, refracting the field's glow into spectra outside human vision. Some carried bioluminescent nodes along their flanks, pulsing in sequences that looked dangerously like language. Then the resonance surged. One of the entities tore free of its flicker state and slammed into the ground fully solid, scattering sand in a blast wave. The thing was enormous, 4 meters tall, body built from asymmetry, with a head that branched like coral and eyes gleaming with multifaceted lenses. Its appendages scissored down toward the equipment. The Hilix split under the blow, bonnet buckling like paper. Sparks leapt from the generators. Kill the field, Talia shouted. If I cut it now, they'll remain. Lachlan roared back. He twisted the dials instead, overloading the resonance. The coils screamed as they pushed beyond tolerance. Energy snapped through the air like a thunderclap. The spectral crowd surged closer. A smaller entity lunged at Talia, appendages whipping in staccato arcs. She dove under its sweep, rolling across the sand, grabbing a length of fractured metal rod. She swung upward, jabbing into the thing's thorax. Instead of piercing, the rod distorted its form, matter and antimatter geometries colliding, before the thing blinked half-translucent again. Lachlan braced the generator housing with both hands. Hold them just a second. The resonance climbed into a banshee wail. The larger creature reeled backward, its sail wings tearing open into spectral filaments that scattered like ink in water. The others flickered violently, as though their existence had been pressed into contradiction. Then, with a detonation like air collapsing, the field snapped off. The desert fell silent. Ash-like residue drifted where the entities had been. The hylix lay broken, electronics dead. The generator array was fused, coils glowing cherry red. Talia crouched by the scorched sand, her hands shaking. Not extinction. Not fossils. They were still here, waiting in the substrate. We didn't replace them, we layered over them. Lachlan stared into the distance where the crystalline tower still pulsed, slow and steady. And if the substrate can hold one state and ours simultaneously, then eventually, it'll decide which frame to keep. Overhead, a faint shimmer rippled across the morning sky, like a mirage stretching from horizon to horizon. The boundary between histories was thinning. The shimmer in the sky grew denser by the hour. By dusk, the horizon rippled like the surface of a boiling ocean. Power grids from Perth to Darwin stuttered, satellites dropped out of sync, and aircraft reported sudden turbulence in calm air. Talia and Lachlan had relocated their camp to a rocky escarpment, setting up what salvaged equipment they could. But even at a distance, the crystalline tower dominated the desert, its geometry rearranging minute by minute. Segments rose and retracted like clockwork parts. With every shift, the spectral figures multiplied, pushing further into solidity. The first major breach came at nightfall. From the tower erupted a wave of entities, hundreds of them, sweeping across the sand in a formation that was neither stampede nor march, but something like a migration. Their reversed chirality bodies refracted moonlight, their joints snapping in fractal patterns. Lachlan lifted the binoculars, though he already knew. They're stabilizing faster. The substrate's choosing them. The earth beneath them trembled. Cracks spiderwebbed through the escarpment as though the land itself was undecided which geometry to obey. Talia whispered, "It's not a war in the way we think. The planet is running two equations at once. Eventually, it'll collapse the wave function, and we might be the ones erased." The assault came before midnight. Entities climbed the escarpment with impossible speed, their sail limbs latching onto rock, pulling their asymmetrical bodies upward in jerks. One leapt directly into the camp, scattering notes, tablets, and instruments into the dust. Talia swung the metal rod she'd been keeping close. It passed through the creature, but instead of resistance, it caused the thing's body to ripple, splintering into mirror images that wavered in and out of phase. The rod itself heated in her hands, scalding her palms. Lachlan snatched up the last working generator, small enough to be carried, and slammed it onto the ground. He tuned it by instinct, forcing the coils into a harmonic against the entity's presence. The generator shrieked, throwing arcs of white light. The creatures convulsed, half dissolving, but several pressed forward regardless, their lenses flashing sequences of light. Talia realized too late, it wasn't random. It was coordinated signaling, a form of military strategy. The largest of them rose over the ridge, easily 6 meters tall. Its sail limbs unfurled like a cathedral of glass, shimmering in reverse spectra. It struck with one appendage, splintering rock, nearly knocking them both from the cliff. Lachlan dragged Talia back as she screamed, clutching her scorched hands. "If this keeps scaling up, we can't win. No weapons, no containment. The only thing that matters is the substrate itself." The generator's oscillation cracked and died. The entities solidified again, more coherent, more present. Talia staggered upright. "Then we don't fight them. We change the constants back." The sky split. Not with lightning, but with geometry, a lattice of light stretching from horizon to horizon, equations written across the firmament itself. Two realities vying for dominance, two histories clawing at the same planet. The desert roared as mountains flickered in and out of existence. Rivers briefly appeared and then vanished, ecosystems swapping like slideshow images. Forests of black crystalline trunks blinked into being for seconds before dissolving back to red desert. Everywhere the world screamed in two voices. Talia clutched Lachlan's arm. This planet was theirs first. If we want to survive, we need to understand why we replaced them. Because if it happens again, we might be the overwritten layer. Above them, the lattice of light pulsed as if considering. And then both realities pressed harder, fighting for permanence. The world did not end in fire. It ended in interference. Across Australia, observers saw the same impossible sights. Bridges flickering into alien spans of black crystal, eucalyptus forests replaced by forests of glassy trunks, highways curving into angles no human engineer could have drawn. Cities quivered, buildings trembling between concrete and unfamiliar substances that dissolved into fractal dust. Talia and Lachlan huddled on the escarpment, surrounded by a landscape caught in strobe light war. The entities surged below them in vast numbers now, whole caravans of reverse chirality organisms moving in patterns that looked deliberate, purposeful. Some glanced upward, their refracting eyes acknowledging the humans as if they too understood the stakes. Lachlan's last generator sat ruined between them. No more interventions, no more resistance. Only observation. "We never belonged here," he said, voice raw. The constants themselves carried their imprint. "We were written on top." Talia's hands still throbbed from the burns, but she forced herself to hold steady. If the substrate chose once, it can choose again. Maybe it isn't about who was first. Maybe it's about who can complete the equation. The ground pulsed beneath them, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a planet deciding. A final shimmer rolled across the sky. The lattice of light collapsed into a single pattern, elegant, spare, impossible to mistake for chance. The air thickened, the escarpment itself wavered. Talia gasped, not from fear but from recognition. The pattern wasn't alien, wasn't human. It was both. A merger or a test. A demand. The entities below stilled, as if listening to the same unspoken question. Lachlan whispered, "It's not erasure this time. It's asking which of us will adapt." The world shifted once more. The escarpment dissolved around them, leaving the two scientists weightless for an instant in a geometry neither desert nor alien plane. Then, silence. A single breath of stillness in a world waiting to resolve. The story closes there. The reader cannot know which frame the planet chose, only that Earth is not what it seemed and belonging is never guaranteed.